It's a real blessing to be here in the sunshine in this beautiful campus. You're probably wondering how I got to know Ray Bradbury. It was during my Air Force years, really rather late in my career, and we hosted him at a conference for a week, and that relationship turned into a friendship and continued as I wrote articles, books about him, and then eventually, in his later years, began the biography trilogy that you see on the first slide. The Bradbury Center that we set up, after Ray passed away, the center now curates archives and artifacts from his entire 7-decade career. And that was due to the gifts of Ray Bradbury, the Bradbury family, and Professor Don Albright, emeritus of the Pratt Institute in New York. I mentioned Don because he was Ray's great friend and bibliographer for decades, and it's important to mention and acknowledge people like Don because I've always felt that the biographer's first duty must always be to acknowledge. If you know the movie Monuments Men, when George Clooney is reporting on those who helped him, his character, identify and find all of the stolen World War II art treasures, he especially mentions to President Truman the name of one who died. And when President Truman didn't repeat the man's name during the conversation, he mentioned him again, because he too felt in that character that you must always acknowledge those who lead the way for you and help you. And I think that's a very strong and important admonition for biographers as well. Well, the 3 volumes ended up being 450,000 words. I was able to get the first one done in 2011 so that he could have it in his hands before he passed away on June 5th, 2012. And I had done basically all the research with him and in his home in Los Angeles and in his second home in Palm Springs for Volume 2, Ray Bradbury Unbound. And then I had enough of my work done with him before he passed away and working then in his archives in the years following that I could finish then Ray Bradbury Beyond Apollo and publish it in 2020 on what would have been or was his 100th birthday, August 22nd, 2020. So during those years, I would usually go to the house in the spring for about a week and then go out again from Indiana in the fall for about a week. And that was always a lot of fun. And in 2007, in the fall, I left him a not quite fair copy manuscript, a rough manuscript of the first book, Becoming Ray Bradbury. When I got back out to him in the spring, about 6 months later, I went to the den, and there in his little working basket was the copy that I gave him, and on the plastic cover, he had written these words: Ray Bradbury, luckily, don't know that I'm, can you all read that? I'm hiding in his body and looking out of his eyes. And he wrote it in his post-stroke hand. He had had a stroke in 1999. And then he wrote it out again with the correct verb above that area. And that really speaks volumes, because that tells you the fascination with the young writer that he had once been, and his fascination equally with the young boy who became that writer. And that was one of the many areas of common ground that fascinated both of us and carries through these 2 biographies. So let's start with the boy. There he is. Okay, that's Shorty, or Shorts, probably in 1925. He's born in 1920. He would eventually grow out of being Shorty, and he attained a height of about 5'10" as a grown-up. And there he is in the neighborhood in Waukegan, Illinois, on the lakeshore north of Chicago, where he lived for most of his first 14 years. He's descended from Mary Bradbury, who came from England in early 1630s and married Thomas Bradbury, And then as an old woman, well-respected matron in that area around Salem in Massachusetts in 1692, she was tried for witchcraft, found guilty, almost 80 years old, with 11 children, most of them still living, and her husband still living. And in 1692 is condemned to death in the witch trials. She had over 100 people in that small community vouch for her character, but because one person said that she had manifested phosphorescent blue boars and cast spells on ships. By blue boar, I mean a boar with tusks, okay? And on his spectral testimony, she was convicted and was waiting to be burned. But the community was able to put it off until the witchcraft phase ended. And she was able to live until the year 1700 and passed away at the age of 85. And her descendants included those who migrated out to Waukegan in the, say, early 1840s, I believe. His great-grandfather was mayor of Waukegan at one time, ran 2 successful newspapers there north of Chicago. His grandfather presided over the decline of those papers. And then by the time Ray is born, his own father, Leo, is a lineman for the power company in Waukegan. He's a very physical man, very, very active, athletic. There were 4 children born into that family. Ray's older brother, Skip, was also very athletic and an athlete. And as they lived on through the 20s and through the Depression and into the 1940s, Ray and his brother, Skip, had to sleep in the same room until Ray was 27 years old in 1947 when he moved out to marry Marguerite McClure Bradbury. And Skip finally figured out that was a good thing to do, and he also got married then at the age of 31 and moved out of the house. But this is not uncommon in the Depression era folks that were just challenged by everything all along the way. In 1932, Dad lost his job with the power company, and they drove all the way out to Tucson, Arizona. He would always say Tucson, Arizona. And Tucson was, of course, a new town in those days. You still had along where the cars would parallel park on the street, you also still had horse ties for people coming in from the outskirts of town or from the ranches. That lasted 9 months. Dad couldn't maintain a business there. Nothing was selling. People weren't buying. So he drove that 1926 Buick all the way back to Waukegan. Ruts in the roads, praying all the way that they wouldn't get stuck, changing fuel pumps twice on the way out, changing gas pumps twice on the way back. We all know that drill from our own ancestors, that kind of thing. In 33, he got the job again back there, but he lost it again in 34. And this time, and that's when this picture was taken, they've gone all the way out to Los Angeles. And he will spend the rest of his life in Los Angeles from 1934 to 2012. Skip's taking the picture, and there's just Ray, because the other 2 children have died. Again, not uncommon. As he used to always say, you visited family on Saturdays, and often you went to the cemetery to visit with family. Skip's twin had died in the great influenza epidemic of 1918. Mama Bradbury, Esther, almost died as well. Ray was born a year and a half later, and then his little sister was Betty Jane, also succumbed to later influenza in the mid-1920s. So just the 2 boys were left of the 4 children. California, here we come. Here he is on the right in that picture. His brother Skip on the left, Leo, his dad, in the middle, and Ray on the right. This is late in his high school years. Yeah, 1938 is when he graduates from LA High School. And what does he do after graduation? Well, his dad is in and out of work for cable companies and that is wire cable companies and power companies during that time. Skip goes off to the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and big, strong guy working in the mountains in Southern California, makes $30 a month, sends $20 home. and that's how they make it. Ray doesn't get to go to college. He spends the 4 years after high school on that street corner, Norton and Olympic in Los Angeles, selling newspapers, okay? He's selling the Herald and Express afternoon paper for 4 years from that stand. And he's making 1 penny off of every 3-cent newspaper that he sells. And the Hollywood stars would come, and they'd buy their papers. And he would go to the theaters, as he had since 1934, when they moved there. And he'd roller skate to the theaters, he'd roller skate to the studios, and every time he saw a movie star, he'd get the autograph. When I started going out, he still had his 2 boxes with 3,000 Hollywood autographs of all the greats, directors, producers, and stars from the 1920s on. And in his later life, he would get to know many of those people who were still alive and work with many of them. It was a providence for him to be in Hollywood and also be very close to Caltech, founded in the early part of the 20th century, and eventually the Jet Propulsion Laboratory there. And these were the places where he would go beyond his work in literature and do a lot of the things that made him famous in our culture through to today. That little group right there is the Los Angeles chapter of the Science Fiction League. It was founded by some of the pulp magazine editors and publishers back in the early 30s. That later became the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, still exists. And it was a gathering place for the many fans who were putting together fanzines, that is, amateur fan magazines, not prozines like the pulps, but they would put together their fanzines, and a number of the members, perhaps a quarter of the members, were also professional genre writers in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Here you'll see, that's our boy right there, okay? That's Ray in the white shirt. So he's 20 years old at this point. So there's Ray. There's Robert A. Heinlein there, who would probably be the most prominent science fiction author on this side of the Atlantic through the 50s and 60s. And Ray's good friend and mentor, Jack Williamson, also a great golden age talent. Heinlein, Williamson, and Bradbury would eventually receive grandmasters status in the science fiction world. So he was off to a good start with these people. What do they do in the society? They had their hobbies beyond even the writing and reading of science fiction. There was a big craze to learn Esperanto, because that was going to be the new language, the language for the future. Everything they did was about the future, okay? Technocracy was another thing they were all into, because in the 20s and into the 30s, there was that movement to set up a new order of things where the economy of the nation would be run by specialists, by scientists, by agricultural experts, people who could handle supply and demand, moving it away from capitalism. It didn't work. The Depression more or less killed that off. But out west, it was still around, and they would have, the people who were active in technocracy would have rallies occasionally in LA and along the West Coast. And Ray was a fan for about 2 years, from about 1940 to 42. And then he went to one of their rallies, and he saw that they all wore gray suits, and they all wore gray shirts, because that was the technocracy color. Green and gray were the technocracy colors. And they would drive around in little gray cars, and sedans and coupes. And when they'd have their rallies, they would salute their leader. And Ray realized then that what he was seeing, it was Russia, it was Germany, it was the same kind of thing. So he drifted away for it because the price was too high, because the leaders of technocracy really didn't care for democracy. So that was his first brush with these kinds of things. Now, as a biographer, one important thing to look for is inflection points in his life. Those moments when there were forks in the road, or when he discovered something that would change the trajectory of the rest of his creative life. And that's important because he was so deeply embedded in our culture and world famous for so long that these points made all the difference for him.